I've got all the major components here cleaned now, ready to be reassembled. The leatherettes I've had off this body and I've put them back on, so that's ready to go. Just about all of these components have been through the degreaser and the ultrasonic cleaner. So now I can start the process of reassembling the camera. This Retina IIIc camera, the components have all been cleaned now and I'm ready to put it back together. So I will start at the beginning. First I start with this piece. This little finger that runs onto the shutter is what I start with. I'm just putting a tiny little bit of molybdenum lubricant in there so that it'll slide up and down smoothly. There are two shoulder screws that hold this. The larger of the two goes at the top. And the smaller of the two goes down the bottom. Make sure that moves up and down smoothly. This has a little return spring. This spring is present on the vast majority of 3Cs. Some of the early ones didn't have it, but most of them do. So I get that screw started and swing that spring into place. Make sure that's tucked in around the screw correctly and do that screw up tight. That's better. That component's done. Here's the shroud it fits into. And here are the buttons that go top and bottom and hold the thing in place. That lock it in place. So just putting a little bit of lubricant in here. This is just a synthetic grease. And this is just so that the buttons slide up and down smoothly. Each of those buttons has a small spring behind it. Which assemble like that. The spring goes into the hole, it doesn't go over the pin. That's one. You have to hold these in place under the spring tension before you assemble the next piece. Yeah, it's reluctant, or it's fallen out of its socket. That's it. Now holding those together, this slides into the outer shroud. There are grooves top and bottom and rails top and bottom here that must match up. It just slides into place and the buttons should clip into position as it comes out. A little bit of extra lubricant's wanted here. So I'll put some grease on that rail. slide that back. Don't let it come all the way out. Now here where the buttons pop out top and bottom, there should be some lubricant there and a little bit more on that rail. That should slide in and out freely, and the button should lock securely. The next component to go in there was the component that had caused so much trouble for the owner, called the sleeve. Now the sleeve, I'm just giving that a blowout to make sure there's no moisture in there. This has come out of the cleaner. The sleeve fits in here. The top of the sleeve bears on this piece. Now I'm sliding this back inside to stop that sleeve from falling out. Otherwise we're back where we started. That piece is ready to go back in the camera. The next task is to get this transfer shaft, which the cocking rat drives, back in place. So normally I'd apply some grease to the back of it and on both faces. That fits down into that hole at the back. This is the bracket that it holds it in place. There is a single screw that holds that, little round-headed screw, very short, unlike any of the others. So I've tightened that up very loosely. I haven't locked it in place. Here's our cocking rack. I've checked that. That's perfect. There's nothing wrong with that. Put the cocking rack in place. I get out my feeler gauges and I want to make sure there's sufficient clearance in here that moves smoothly, and I've found from experience that 4 thousandths or 0.102 millimetre works just nicely. So I slide that in there, slicking that screw off slightly, slide it to the back towards the back of the camera, do the screw up. Check if that works. Seems a little bit stiff. This bracket swung around slightly. I'm just going to poke that into line. Square it up. It seems a little bit stiff. I'll just check. No, that 4 thou shim fits down there nicely. Okay, the rat can come back out. We have our assembly here ready to go on. That arm has to come up through here, through that hole. So I'll slide that on over there, give it a wriggle, and it's back in place. There's 4 screws need to go in there. Two at the top and 2 at the bottom. Now these are going into threaded inserts which are comparatively loosely press fitted into the shroud section. So don't press down on the screwdriver, you'll just pop them straight back out and then you'll have to fish them out and put them back. Just go at it gently. One more in my home and hosed. That's all four in place, and I can tighten them up. Now, before extending this front section again, we need to drop in the shutter release shaft to hold that sleeve in place, otherwise it's in danger of falling in. At the moment it can't get away because it's trapped nicely in place. That shutter release is very stiff there, there's something right. Let's slide it up. Oh yes, I can see. Now, this piece here, the bottom of that bracket that the shutter release slides down, is bent, and it probably means that the shutter release shaft was forced down onto it instead of into the hole. So I'm just going to bend that back into place. That's made that unusually stiff. Right, next thing to do is put in the transfer shaft. This shaft takes the action of the cocking rack, transfers it to the shutter. So a little bit of grease on the end is always a useful thing. That drops in to that little socket at the back of the body. There's its bracket, it slides on, the tab faces to the front. There's a single screw goes in there, a very short round head screw, it's the only one like it on the camera. So I'll just snug that up, not doing it up tight. Next thing to do is to put the cocking rack in. Centre that up on there. We need to make sure there's enough clearance for the cocking rack to run smoothly, and I've found from experience that 4/1000th of an inch or 0.102 millimeters, this set's telling me, is just right. So I slide that down between the cocking rack and the body. That screw is loose. I push that towards the back of the camera as far as it'll go and tighten the screw up. And the cocking rack should run smoothly without there being too much unnecessarily play there. If there's too much play, the rack can drift backwards and forwards. If it drifts backwards and forwards, inevitably the teeth on the gear on that shaft will only be contacting part of the width of the rack, and so it will fail. It'll fail early. It needs to be contacting all the way across as far as possible. So I'm just making sure that that bracket is still square. That's moving smoothly. That's ideal. I can take the rack out now. We can slide this component in, complete with its sleeve. The inner piece is pushed well back, which holds that sleeve in place, stops it from falling out. This shaft has to come up through that hole. Give it a gentle wriggle, it should fit into place. There are 4 screws that hold this in place, countersunk screws. 2 of them will be bright and clean, and quite possibly they're a little bit chewed up looking because these are the screws that have had lots of torque put on them. They go at the top. I'm putting them in quite loosely to start off with because I want to be able to wriggle this about a bit to make sure we get all the screws in. The screws are going into little inserts which are pressed into place in the inside, and they're only pressed quite lightly, so they're easy to displace, and it's a bugger putting them back. So not much downward pressure on that screwdriver, just turning that in gently and not doing it up tight is the order of the day. These two screws on the bottom are instantly recognisable because they will be brown. It'll be a mixture of rust and adhesive, probably, mostly rust. They're all in, I can do them up tight. Before we slide that centre section forward, we need to drop in the shutter release shaft to stop that sleeve from getting away. That's working nicely now. That slides forward and you can see the action happening here. I'm going to slide that back in place. Make sure we don't lose anything while we're continuing with the rest of the work. Now I've got to reassemble the focus mechanism.